Are we live? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. So I left off last week that we were continuing to work with the application, but what I'd been noticing Friday was a delay in the data stream. And what we came across was that it was, when I started doing some analysis, it was like 6 minutes, 8 minutes, 12 minutes behind because of the, I'm going to say it's the increased volatility. Increased volatility increases the volume and everything starts slowing down for what's being broadcast out for free by these brokers. And I thought, well, Schwab's a big brokerage. There's a lot of programs written for it, so maybe I will add Tasty Trade. Tasty Trade has an API, and it does streaming. I've got an account, so I can do free API stuff there as well. So this week I spent integrating the Tasty Trade API data stream, and it was a little bit different than the Charles Schwab. And some of the differences are good, some of the differences are bad. You know, everything's done differently at all these companies. And so what we have now is I've got 2 live streams, and while I was working on Tasty, it looked like it was keeping up and staying on top of everything, because I know in the past when we've had these high volatility days, I had no issues executing trades. Well, there's a difference between the trading platform and executing trades on it versus getting this API data feed for the live streams. And what I've learned is that, you know, as Dr. Jim would always say, is that every gimme has a gotcha, and it works. But as if you will look, what I'm displaying here is some of the latest work that I've done, and up in this upper right corner, I can now switch between Schwab and Tasty from a data feeds for the live candles. So what I found is the 1 minute candle feeds are fine. You know, they aggregate, close out, and so within a minute of that minute closing, I have access to the 1 minute candle. So everything that you see here going back, that's all 1 minute candle data from Schwab. Perfect, good, no issues. And what we've been trying to do is get more real-time live data. And the only way to do that is to subscribe to the live data feed and do some work. And I also need the live data feed to get some volumes for sales and stuff to help generate the footprints and the deltas. And Schwab right now is 9 minutes behind on its data feed. I'm not losing data. You know, it's transmitting. It's just it's transmitting it 9 minutes later in time than when it was created, you know, when the action happened. So I am like 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm like getting the detailed information on this candle right here on the Schwab feed. And on the Tasty feed, it's over 40 minutes behind. So it's even worse. You know, I thought it'd be better, but it's worse. They both keep up perfectly fine in normal volumes, but when you start getting these spikes and you're moving 30, 40, 60 points in a 2 minute time span like we've been doing all week, then these data feeds become delayed. And as you can see, right now Schwab is behaving better than what Tasty was, but the Tasty data may be a little bit better quality under a normal market. I'm going to start reaching out to both of their supports to see why these feeds are so delayed. You know, because I'm trying to avoid having to pay for a commercial style data feed to get real-time data to make all this stuff. And really, this is a research platform and to help assist in trading. But if I can't do the assisted live trading, then we'll go down other paths. But the research is starting to pay off. You know, I think I showed last week when I implemented the imbalances and how the footprints, when we get a certain signal where we get a cross where you have a negative footprint and a positive delta, or a positive footprint and a negative delta, that's a reaction zone that if I get those two in combination of getting a flip and a delta is the equivalent of like we're hitting this and I'm getting a reversal off of this, and that's something that you want to see. And if I get confirmation, then more than likely I'm going to get a stronger move, and depending on the conditions. I haven't done enough research yet to validate, but one of the suppositions was that if you come into an area quickly, then it's going to react more quickly away from it. So the bigger the reaction, the faster the move into it, the faster the reaction off of it. And what I've seen over time is that if we hit this, like we have a sell zone here, and this candle is going into it, coming back into it, but it's right after we created the sell zone itself. So in the reaction, I shouldn't expect anything big. But if we come back in time and work our way up to it, depending on how fast I move into this, the bigger the reaction would be to go away from it. And then subsequently, I would adjust this as it gets moved into. And then the next visit up to it, depending on the speed, I should get another reaction at this new established low point in this case. And so that's what we were working towards. But then I wanted to get more real-time data because I'm starting to watch this in real time, and I'm wanting that real-time signal to come out to where I can make my decision and do the trade, because I've seen a massive improvement on the quality of trade knowing that this is happening and then getting into the trade. But I can't time it out, so I may have to look at building other tools within the other trading platforms for real time, because you're getting a closer real time demonstration. I don't know if I'll do it in the Thinkorswim or TradingView or this NinjaTrader, or NinjaTrader actually has some of these tools. It's just not all combined on one page for me to see things. So that's kind of the path, but I'm going to keep developing this platform because it's doing great for generating the research and doing the analysis on the research. It's just that what I have here now is that we don't get a nice live feed because the data feeds are lagging with the increased volatility that we've had this week. If things calm down and this goes back to live, we're within 2 to 3 seconds, then it will prove useful as a make your trade with the tool. So that's what we're looking at right now, and I thought I would share. So one of the cool things, if I could show it to you, I would. If I can flip between data platforms where I used to be able to, it's everything's a work in progress right now. So, but I should be able to flip between whether I'm using the Tasty feed or the Schwab feed. I've got the little signal. Yellows meaning we're delayed. Red means I'm not getting a feed at all. Green means we're within 15 seconds of live, because I had to define, and I feel comfortable if I'm only 15 seconds behind on the data feed. And what we mean by the data feed is that I am constantly getting data in, but the provider is giving me data that's 9 minutes old or 43 minutes old, and it's progressing as it's sending out. It has what's a backlog of events that it's sending out, but it will only send out 1 a second or 2 a second, because I looked at the Tasty stuff. We started doing metrics. I want to update the live tick if I can, to where it's jumping not once a second, but as often as it possibly can as the data feed, as the data comes in. And what I found is that Tasty sends out about 2 a second, so roughly every 500 milliseconds, and Schwab sends out at a little over 1 second, whatever it had aggregated and combined. So in that way, I'm getting 2 events to every 1 on the Tasty side, and that way, in a manner of speaking, it's a better quality. But what I've also found is that it's also lacking. So I am right now using the 1 minute candle from Schwab as my Bible, and I did validate that the tasty 1 minute candles match 100%, 99.9% the candle data I get from Schwab, but with tasty I was missing volume. I'm not sure where the volume comes from or how the tasty platform displays its volume or how it's deriving it, but when I go through the API, the candle request you get only gives you the basic data. It doesn't give you the volume related to that candle. I can get volume a different way and add it in. And that's kind of what I'm doing with the live feed. I'm getting live volume data and live data that's called sale and time data. But what I found, if I was just looking at sale and time, because sale and time also has a volume to it of how many items were sold at that time. But it seemed to be more of a sampling, because when I started doing it over hours and comparing to the 1 minute candles, I was getting roughly 10% of the data. It was 10 to 13%, and it was always 10 to 13%. So to me, that seems that I'm getting a consistent amount of data. It's just not the full amount, and it's more, I would be treated more like a sampling. And so I could take that sampling and then take what my known data is. So then I'd know my sampling, this was my buy at the bid, and this is my sells at the ask, or buys at the ask. Whatever transaction happened, was it at the bid, or was it at the ask, or was it something else? And since I'm getting it twice as often, I'm getting a little bit more granular, even though it's a sampling, and then I could just extrapolate that out and get something that's probably closer to the real than what I was getting on the Schwab feed. And knowing that it was 90%, that my volume data that I'm getting on the tasty side is like 97% to what the Schwab, so the live feed I'm getting like 97%. So that's telling me I'm losing 3% somewhere in the live feed. But when I look at the Schwab live feed and start comparing it to the 1 minute, I'm getting something similar. So the live feeds, you're not getting everything. Not everything's perfect on the live feeds, and that's expected, but 97%, that's close enough. And that also rates why you only build these temporary candles for your live until you actually get an authoritative candle that then overrides everything. And that's what we're looking for. I want to so live gives me the approximation, and I know it's an approximation, but it's better than nothing. And then you get the authoritative 1 minute candle, which I'm on a 2 minute thing, so we have to wait a couple of minutes to get that authoritative candle to print. But while it hasn't printed, I use the live feed information. That way we don't get drift, because the live stuff would get you drifted off very erroneously, and this is how you keep it close and on point. And then I feel that the delta data on the tasty stuff will be closer, because I noticed on these high volume days when it starts coming in, I was getting like quadruple digits for delta, and we know that's not true, except on these real live spikes. These news generated spikes where you jump 100 points in seconds. Because the announcements that have been coming out have been driving the algos crazy, and there's just an instant push, and then it drifts after that. And it's when you get into the drifting after the signal noise that you know that you're doing okay. And if you look, we're getting these big push-ups, but then after a while it settles out, and then it's strictly trading by the technicals, and then you get a push. I'll have to go look and try to time it out with announcements, but this is like you're typical. You're bouncing up against a resistance zone. So here it was a resistance here. You bounced off of it several times after some initial pushes. You're drifting down below it, but hitting the next technical levels, but still bouncing off of it, but bouncing up here, and then you get what's called like a buyer shut off, is that no, you get a frequent stop of buying, so now it's got to find liquidity, so it drops down. And that liquidity is provided or more at these technical levels. And since it's been volatile, we're seeing that I'm getting a separation between, so this and this on calm days overlap, but this is telling you that we're getting some deviations on how much volume's happening in nearer terms versus the longer term frameworks. And so we have differences here showing up. And so these two lines usually mirror each other pretty closely, but we've had a gap develop on the longer term because it was really volatile this morning. I think we're an ATR on the 2 minute for a 14 period was north of 70 again, and it's been north of 70 almost every day this week. And so you get these divergences. You can see this is where the divergence pattern happened. Let me scroll down a little bit. So around 12 o'clock Eastern, a little bit after 12 o'clock Eastern. So there's probably a news event that happened at that point that caused a spike up. And this spike up is causing these divergences here where these two lines are usually one-on-one on top of each other. And so they've separated out. And so it's the news spikes that catch you on these bad trades. And after the bad trades, you get back into a more normal trading pattern. And you can actually use what I've been working on. And it's just that, and with the higher volatility, we're getting bigger moves on these trading patterns. So you should be able to harvest a little bit more. So where you're shooting for 10 or 15 points, you can go to 20 to 30 points and still be within expectations. So that was the big changes this week. So I've learned a lot. The Tasty data feed is different because they use a third party. So you had to get your OAuth to get into Tasty. But then once you're inside Tasty, you had to request another key. And with that key, then you go off to the third party and get your request. And so obviously whatever they've done their agreement with that third party, it's a DX feed, I think, or something like that. I have to go back and look. Anyway, that third party, they have an agreement, and so you don't get the full details. You know, everything I know Tasty's primary focus is on options, and so there's a lot of options live data you can get, and so I'm going to utilize that because I don't know if I can get live feed data off of Thinkorswim, Charles Schwab's API, and get what the deltas and the gammas, because we're wanting to get the Greeks on the options later on. So right now I'm working on the day trading piece, but later on we're going to incorporate options and options trading and options monitoring to where we can know that we're getting good pricing on options, that this is a good time to enter in on an option, or if I have positions on these options and I've met certain earnings threshold on it within a shorter amount of time, then you want to get out of that option. It's being an active management of options, because that was part of the managing the theta portfolio, is that you're selling a lot of theta, and if theta comes in quicker than expected, you actually want to close it out and establish new positions to where you can set yourself up for potentially harvesting more theta that may potentially come in quicker. And so that kind of helps compound your earnings on a theta portfolio. So that's some of the work that will be going into this application further down the road. Right now we're building out the day trade, get the charts working and stuff, and then we'll expand it out. So that's kind of the long roadmap. But right now we're on the short roadmap of just getting things working, and it was quick. I got this working within a week. So I started working seriously on Monday, making all the code changes to incorporate Tasty. And then once we had it incorporated, yesterday I saw delays, and so today I built this little layout here because we're mainly switching between things. But now I can I can click either Schwab or Tasty and it'll switch, and we have monitoring of the data delays, because it's become really apparent that data delay is really an issue. And another thing will tell you which candle I'm currently using for the live candles. We're using the Schwab data source. So it's not clicking, but I've been doing a lot of changes today just to get to this point. But this is today's work right here, just to get this. And one of the things I've learned with the working with the agents, the agents are great, but they don't understand everything, and it's that lack of understanding that you do need a person to direct the agent, especially with this. So I am dealing with 2 APIs. These APIs are storing things for their timestamps. Some are UTC, some is the local time zone of where the data is coming out of, like Tasty's coming out of Chicago. So I'm getting some information from Tasty in Central, but then the data feed that it's feeding me, it's giving me data time-stamped in East Coast, even though they labeled their stuff as saying UTC. It's not UTC, it's East Coast time. And then I'm storing this data. I'm storing this data in a local database on my computer, and I'm in Central. And so it will do all the time offsets in, it'll do it in UTC, but they'll do UTC offset by the Central time zone that I'm in based on daylight savings and all that. So you got a lot of, just on the times, you got a lot of timestamps, and each timestamp is not comparable to the other. You have to adjust and clean things out and make sure, and the agent doesn't keep track of it as well. And I'm not sure if I'd have to feed in all the specific data details to an agent with every question to make the fix, or to do the development work with all this understanding, but I have to repeat it every time I give it a new task. I'm learning the agents and learning to work with them. And that this is an example of, we're not working with a simple system. I don't have control over the time because I'm dealing with other systems feeding me information, but I have to keep track of the time, and I'm confident now because I had to do a review of all the time signatures and where they're getting it, because you have multiple times. When I first did this, I want the delay. My delay was 1 to 2 seconds, and one was like negative, just because there's a difference on my PC clock versus their clock. Everything's, you try to sync it, and we had like a negative 0.24 milliseconds or something like that. And it's like, oh, your feed's normal, it's on time, everything you're getting. It's like, no, I want the timestamp for what the data is for, because there are 2 timestamps there. One timestamp is when it was transmitted, then another timestamp is for what the data is representing. So it's just going through, you make a requirement and you say this, and it's like, well, I'm not getting what I'm looking for, and then I made, one of the things is that once we had the feed working, all of a sudden my live candles disappear. You don't see any live updates happening here. The reason is that everything's so delayed in time that it doesn't display. And a few times I've released it and said, display wherever it is, and you'll come out over here, you can see another candle overlaid over here updating in live time. But I've even lost that. I guess because we've fallen so far back. But we've also been making a lot of changes, so I may not have everything back in sync, because some of these changes you have to shut down and restart. And that kind of goes with the data quality for this week. I'm not going to really use for any research, because I've had to shut down, stop, restart multiple times every day, like full stops and restarts of data feeds. And what I also noticed is if I go to here in services, yeah, I'm not even getting feed updates, even though I know I'm getting information. Oh, did we finally shut down? Okay. Let me start everything back up. Let's see. Maybe we're not so far behind. Because I think this last update I didn't have to make changes to the data services. They were all running. Okay. Let's see where we are. Okay, let's refresh this here. Click it to live. Okay. So looking here, Schwab's only 53 seconds behind. Tasty, on the other hand, is 90 minutes behind. So it is steadily falling further and further behind. I'm going to have to take a look in detail on that feed and see why. But Schwab is caught up where it was only 8 minutes behind. So I actually do have candles forming. And you can see I've got imbalances here, even since we've closed here. We closed at 4 o'clock. We were in a sell signal here that started. It ate up. These are not forming like they should. I have to go back with all the changes I've made this week. You know, things break, so this is the thing you got to go back and fix. You know, because I did make a lot of changes to the chart, and we made some changes to the data feed where I can get the live candles in, but of course that's going to break something else, and so now you've got to bug fix that. So that will be on the work list, is to help do the bug fixes on these data feeds that do the imbalances, because I can see a sell imbalance generating, but it was generating into a previous sell imbalance. You know, and so this sell imbalance should be closed now, and it's not. So this is just work that has to be done to figure out what's going on. You know, so this week's data, I'm not going to try to do any evaluations, you know, because now we've got to stabilize everything again since I added this data feed. And what we'll do going forward is that I'll take the two data feeds, Schwab and Tasty, and apply these rules to it and see if I get a better quality. You know, are my deltas better? Because see here, we've got a quadruple digit to the negative, which I think might line up around this time period. You know, I just don't have time stamped on here, so I'm not sure which candles over here represent this path of 60 points. You know, so we have nearly 2,000 deltas sold, but the movement, you know, there's more selling, but the price jumped around within that movement, but you had overall negative pressure. And so that's what we'll have to work on. So that's kind of the plans going forward to next week, is now that I've got all these changes in, now we've got to restabilize. You know, and it's good to see that at least Schwab is caught up back to real time. So Schwab may be more stable. Tasty may give me some more accurate numbers for doing research with, you know, since its granularity is different. But we won't know until we start comparing and testing, and it's just going to mean I got to collect data. You know, everything's data driven, and eventually that stuff will feed down into this report here. And that's another bug I'm going to need to fix. I need to get this to where, even though it's doing updates, we're not messing with this, or maybe I pull this out into a wholly separate page on its own for doing research, because, you know, it's bypassing and this is growing, so I may have to rearrange things to make it more user friendly and to get more real estate back for this. So now it's kind of a rambling session because it was a busy week just pulling in a whole new data feed, you know, and that's what it is, a whole new data feed, and getting this back into a usable state. You know, we're not quite back to that usable state, you know, That was the frustrating part for the week, is that I'm not getting it back to a usable state like I'd want, but then considering the activity of the market this week, and what we've learned, and giving us another access point to more information that we can pull into the application. It's a win and a lose. Every gimme has that gotcha. And so, but it's also, I'm learning that, under high stress, this stuff is not going to work very well for doing live trading. And that's another reason why when you go through these really high volatile points, you do the trades you have to do the trades for, and you try to sit stuff out, because all you could be doing is just getting yourself into bigger trouble just because of the volatility that's been coming through in the market. Let's see, let me return to latest. Okay, there we go. So we're getting some overlapping on the cells, and we'll have to work out, because this should be gone. I believe this should be gone too, because we had cells here. This closed up, and so this should have moved up to here. Actually, it should be almost closed under this. Looking at when it formed over here on this candle, expanded down on this candle, but was totally eaten away. So this should not be here at all, and this should be gone too. So I've got things that should not be, but it's been a busy week, and I've just gotten to the point where I'm getting live candle feeds back, and the next step is to get from live candle feeds into the other areas that we have to work on. So everything's got to be worked back in. We did make some changes to the basic workflow to where I get my candles fed in as close to real time as possible versus getting written to a database, because when these high volumes, I'm putting extra work on the local database, so things are building up, and I still want to be able to display the data as soon as I have it, when it's in a workable format, which is within a fraction of a second of it coming in. And so I want to get the data up here and updating. So if you notice, compared to last week, this candle's flipping a lot quicker than it was in the past, because in the past we're waiting for an extra database write happening to store the information before it would then display the information. So I've kind of moved the order around to where I'm displaying the information while it's still in memory and has it committed to the database. And then we have a database table that we'll take, and then we combine it and store 1 minute increments of the information to where I can have a minute to minute match up. But I can also keep my footprint match up too, to where I can do research with the footprint data, because that's what we're doing. We're doing, since footprint data is not time specific, it's volume specific. So then you get the intersection of volume and time, and that's where the edge is being created in this kind of trade that we're working on. And from the research I did last week, we're looking at we got the restart. I got to put it back in. We'll look at last week's data. We feed it in. Let's run it. It may take a little while since there's a lot of work going on in the system. Okay, so the reason why we're doing all this work, well, let's see, last week, qualified flip. Okay, the quality's fallen off. We'll have to look. But the prior weeks until last week, it was higher. We were hitting at a 70% clip, but it could be that the volatility from Friday started shattering all this. So it just tells me that more research has to be done, because we were hitting at a 70% clip rate when I qualified a flip. Well, here we go. This is the line. So if we're moving in a direction and I have the first interaction, I expect it to draw down. What we're finding is that 70% of the time on that first hit, it drops 15 points 70% of the time, and it'll drop 30% of the time, nearly half. So I'm getting it definitely, so I can set up a risk of lose 10, make 15, and 70% of the time I will get my 15. And we've got to do further studies to see how often does it drop. Do I go through and get taken out of the trade by hitting the limits? That's additional work, but knowing that it pulls back 70% of the time is a good indicator that I'm moving, I'm getting this flip, and when I get that flip signal, it's going to pull back 15 points, and 15 points can be a lot. And so that's what we're working at now. We've been doing other studies and stuff, but this one, the signal was so strong. The other ones were like 60% of the time. Since this is 70% of the time, I really want to go down the path of this one, as far as I can take it, to see exactly what I can get. But it's very heartening seeing the 70%, and then we can work out what other things help qualify to see if I can bump up that 70% rate to a higher rate, if it's possible. But we won't know until we know. It's just that when I was getting delayed by Schwab, since we've closed, we've caught up, so that's a good thing. And Tasty's still falling behind, so I will have to work. We'll have to do some research on the Tasty feed and see what can be done. Okay, well, I know I've talked about a lot of stuff. It's exciting this week. A lot of changes and a lot of potentials, and that's where we'll close it out for this week. So next week is stabilize, get things fixed out on this. Hopefully, I get cleaner data feeds to where we can start continuing the analysis work. And with that analysis work, I will be going down the Schwab data route and then also the Tasty data route to see out of these two, is there any kind of variances as well? Because, as I've talked about in the past, the Schwab data, since it's a 1 second combination of activity, that it wasn't I'm not getting true delta. And then based on the kind of information I was getting, we have to make assumptions that if price moved up, then it's buy pressure, and you tend to allocate all of it. Well, with the Tasty feed, I'm getting a little bit more granular, but it's a sampled rate, and I'm only getting 10% of the data. But that 10% of the data gives me more information, is that I had this many at the bid, this many at the ask. And so now I can take that sample and extrapolate. So where I'm probably overstating the deltas on these, I'm probably getting closer with the Tasty data, and I want to see if that comes out. Do I get more signals because I have more accurate data, and start looking at what's the differences between these two, because that's where you'll figure out on the differences between the two. You'll get a pattern out of that, saying, well, my assumption of doing this is overstating it or understating it. And well, we'll go. We have to wait till the data comes out. I'm just extrapolating on assumptions right now. And so next week we'll be work on getting the data streams stable, and hopefully the data streams from the brokers themselves. Because before I had to restart it, I was going to explain is that on this updates about every few seconds, the status of the stream, what Charles Schwab was doing was cutting the stream off totally. And so then we'd have to reestablish. So I'm not sure if I got any data gaps, because I know I was down to less than a second, because as soon as we get the data stream cut, I've already got stuff looking for that. And so as soon as it gets cut, it reconnects. And no, so I should have been less than a second of reconnecting, hopefully. And if I was, then I hopefully got the next feed uninterrupted, since it's pushing out like a heartbeat every second or so, a little over a second. So if I get cut by, I think they were just because of the sheer volume, they're trying to manage their data flows too, is that they started cutting off everything. They're just dropping everybody, and only the robust systems will reconnect, and then all the other systems will not connect, and so it cuts down on their bandwidth that they need to transmit, because these high volume days, you're transmitting a whole lot more data than what you're used to, and so they've got their own data limits on their side, and so they won't stop you from reconnecting. That was sure. And I didn't see any gaps. I had the agent go through and establish. The only time I had gaps is that last night my Docker session locked up, or it tried to do an update, and because it was trying to do an update, things got out of whack, so it didn't record information for several hours. So another reason why I'm not going to count this week as a week to trust for doing data between the development, losing. It's off hours, it's not market hours, but even during market hours today, since it's a week I've written off, I've had to do stops and restarts, but those are usually only minutes down. So it's been a week. Here's where I can manually change the data source on this side. This is what I was doing manually before I incorporated it in, to where I can just click here and switch. And how I know I switched is that I have it to where the candle colors change. So blue replaces green, purple replaces red. It's just where I know that I've switched data sources. But if you can see here, we're so far behind what's considered live that I'm in a different area. We're an hour and a half behind. We're not even on this chart with the Tasty data that's coming in. But it's still coming in. I'll have to go back and look at Tasty's data to make sure it's not generating any gaps and everything, to where I can at least maybe trust it. It's just a delayed trust, and I can still do research off of it. Okay, well, I think we'll call it an end to the session. It's been an interesting day, to say the least, an interesting week, and I hope everybody's had good trading this week. I had a green week. That's the goal, is to keep it green every week.